The story I'm about to tell you is not one I personally experienced, but one told to me by my father, who experienced it firsthand many years ago. He went on a coon hunting trip one autumn night with his uncle and a family friend of theirs. For those who don't know what coon hunting is, it is hunting raccoons, usually at night, using a scent hound bred for that type of thing. It was common in the southern United States, and that's where it took place, in a remote rural area in the southeastern U.S. in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It would be noted that a good trained coon hound never left a raccoon. It tracks and corners it up a tree. My uncle had 2 fully trained, reliable coon hounds with an excellent hunting record. On this particular night, the 3 men each had a light source. One had a carbide lamp, another had a brand new flashlight with brand new butterflies, and another had a lantern. The location they chose to hunt in was an area my uncle had been many times. It was truly a remote area, far removed from civilization, and was one of the most beautiful wilderness areas one had ever seen. It was located near a national park. The night they drove a little further out than they usually did and let the dogs out. It didn't take long for the dogs to track down a coon. The men followed the dogs and had to walk quite a bit off the regular path this time. They ended up well outside the usual area. It was an area my uncle was not familiar with. They found the dogs at a very large tree situated on a cliff. There were no other trees around it, and they could hear the sound of water flowing into a creek beneath the cliff. The strange thing about the tree was this stone that was sitting beneath it. My dad said the stone resembled a gravestone. The way it was positioned upright just below the tree, and the way it looked almost as if it had been placed there. As soon as the hunting party reached the tree where the dogs were, the dogs suddenly went silent and walked away from the area, in the direction from which the group had just come. My uncle noticed that the dogs' behavior was uncharacteristic for them, because they had never just walked away like that when there was a coon. My dad thought it was odd as well. He said he'd never seen them act that way. It was as if something had spooked them. Baffled by the dog's behavior, still, they decided to look to see if there was a coon there. My dad leaned against the stone and shone his light up into the tree. There was no coon to be found, which again was highly unusual. If there wasn't a coon, what were they chasing? As soon as my dad leaned against the tree and shone the light into it, their friend's light went out. My dad said that as soon as their friend uttered the words, "My light went out," the other 2 lights simultaneously went out as well. Alone in the woods and completely in the dark, a feeling of uneasiness settled over the men. My uncle, who was a logical-minded man, calmly stated, "There is probably a reasonable explanation for what had just happened. We need to all remain calm. Let's just step away from here and make our way back to the Jeep." So they headed back the way they came. About half a mile to a mile on their way back, their lights all came back on, as if nothing had happened. They found the dogs a little farther down the way, nearer to the Jeep. My dad never went back there to hunt again. What is interesting to note is that particular area is where a well-known area of a park where lots of people through the years drowned in the river there. It is reported to be a haunted spot. There have been ghost sightings and all kinds of strange occurrences in that area. It's possible they wandered into the park near that very spot where some unfortunate soul drowned. I started seeing ghosts when I was a kid. First memory I have is going to an elderly neighbor's house with my mom when I was about 5. We were walking to her house. I saw this elderly man standing in her garden. He smiled and appeared friendly. My mom walked on by him without saying a word. He never said anything either. I thought it was strange, but didn't say anything. We got inside the house and was chatting with the neighbor when I saw him in the hallway to the living room. He was watching us and smiling and not saying anything. I saw a photo of him in the living room with the neighbor lady, so I figured he must live there. Still, I noticed no one looked at him or said anything to him. Finally, the curiosity got the best of me, and I said, "Who is that man in the hallway smiling and looking at us?" My mom and neighbor said no one was there, and looked at me confused. I said, "The man in the picture is standing in the kitchen smiling at us. No one is saying anything to him." They told me that that was impossible, because that was her husband, Bud, and Bud died 2 weeks ago, and that was why my mom came to visit her. Second time was when I was visiting my uncle's house. He and his wife had just gotten a water bed, which was popular at that time. He was showing it to my mom, and as we walked up to the stairs to their bedroom, I saw this man who appeared to be in his late 20s, early 30s, sandy blonde hair, wearing only boxers, pacing back and forth in the upstairs hallway. We walked right by him, and again, no one but me looked or said anything to him. I thought that was strange. He continued to walk back and forth on that strip of hallway outside the door, and even looked in the room at us a few times. Again, I was curious about what was going on, so I asked my mom and uncle, "Who is the man walking around the hallway?" They looked confused. My uncle said no one should be there. Let me go look. He comes back a few minutes later and said he saw no one. I said, "He is still outside the door." My uncle got quiet for a minute, sighed, and said, "Well, he's harmless then. Don't worry about it." My mom, even more concerned, asked my uncle what he meant by that and what was going on. My uncle then said that my cousin, who is the same age as me, had also reported seeing a man in their house. My uncle said he would tell my mom more about it, and we went downstairs. They made me play outside while they talked. I found out years later from my mom that my cousin, who also saw the man, was not believed by his parents at first, that it was something other than an imaginary friend. That was until my cousin started saying that the man lived in that house and wanted to know why they were there. My aunt took him to a psychiatrist and everything. She eventually did some research on the house and discovered that a man in his early 30s had committed suicide in that house in the early 80s, a few years before they bought it. Also, my cousin's younger brother was old enough to talk. He also began reporting that he too saw the man and was absolutely terrified of him because he said he would come into their room. He was so terrified he didn't want to sleep by himself. He refused to sleep in his bedroom. Another ghost sighting happened a few years later, when I was around 8 or 9. My brother and I used to play near a creek in the backyard. Across the creek was an old house. This kind-looking old man would come outside the house and watch us play, but never said a word to us. He seemed to really enjoy watching us play and didn't even seem weird at all. He seemed to be a genuine, nice guy. He had white hair, was very fair-skinned, skinny, and always wore the same dress clothes, a button-up beige dress shirt, and a dark brown dress pants and dress shoes. The thing that made me begin to feel a little uneasy was the fact that my outgoing brother never acknowledged the old neighbor man. He never looked in his direction nor said a word. See, I didn't notice this the first few times we played back there, and never thought anything weird because the man seemed harmless. One day I finally got the courage to ask my brother if he saw the man sitting there on the porch. We were very close to the house, so he could clearly see anything that was there. My brother looked up and around and asked me if I was messing with him and trying to scare him. I couldn't believe it. There the man was as clear as day, and yet I was the only one who saw him. I told my brother I was going back to the house and should come back with me, but he didn't, so I went to the house and asked my mom who lived in the house. She said that no one had lived in that house for years. I told her about the old man, and she said to get my brother and not go back there until her and my dad checked it out. I never saw him again. The story doesn't end there, though. It gets even more creepy. A few years later, a family moved into that house. We made friends with the 2 girls who lived there. One day, the oldest girl told us that their house was haunted. They said they heard their cabinet doors in the kitchen open and close sometimes, and no one would be there, and the light switches would turn on and off. She said that her younger sister said she saw the ghost and described him as an older gentleman, and said his name was Frank, and that he lived in that house. The family eventually moved away not long after that. Years later, I was walking with my grandma at the cemetery above our house, and she commented that this grave we went by was that of the neighbor who lived behind our house. He died in the 1960s when my dad was a baby. According to his tombstone, he was 62 when he died. His first name? Frank. I asked my grandma if he was a fair-skinned, white-haired, slim-looking man, and she said yes and asked if I'd seen a picture of him. I told her the story. It creeped her out, too. I had a strange experience when I was at my first job. I was 19 and working night shift at a house taking care of severely disabled people who couldn't talk, walk, or do anything on their own. I was washing dishes when I looked up and saw what I thought was my coworker walking into one of my clients' rooms to check on them. I wanted to speak with her, so I followed her into the room, and there was no one there but the client, who was sleeping in bed. I looked out the window of the room and saw my coworker outside fixing another coworker's car. They were both outside. I honestly wasn't paying close attention to the woman I saw who walked into that bedroom. I just noticed she had short hair and was about the same height as my coworker. When my coworker came back inside, I told her that I could have sworn I saw her walk into the bedroom, and so I followed her, and no one was in there. I thought I was losing my mind. My coworker looked at me and said that what I saw wasn't unusual, or the first person who claimed to see a woman in that house. Apparently, the place had been the scene of a double homicide many years ago. A man and a woman were shot to death while they slept in their bed. Many people apparently have reported seeing what they believe to be the woman's ghost.
I originally posted this in the ghost subreddit, but I thought people here might want to hear it too. This really happened. Take my word for it if you wish. If not, that's fine too. As far back as I can remember, I've always enjoyed learning about history, including military history. As an early teen, my dad got me a copy of Time Life's The Civil War, Gettysburg. I looked through it and read it constantly. I was particularly drawn to a photo of a deceased soldier pictured at Devil's Den. I never forgot it. Fast forward about 20 years. My wife and I decided to visit Gettysburg on Halloween for our wedding anniversary. My first stop had to be Devil's Den. The Gettysburg Military Park has tons of one-way little roads. The road towards Devil's Den had a few. We missed a turn or something and we got lost. It was approaching evening, but not dark. It was overcast with a little drizzle. My wife and I were getting a little hungry, so we decided to come back the next day. Driving back into town, I pulled up to a deserted road that was also a four-way stop. This is where I saw it. Sitting at the stop sign, I automatically looked to make sure it's clear to drive off. As I was about to pull away, I saw something to my left that was probably close enough to reach out and touch. There, floating in mid-air about torso height, was what looked like a cotton button shirt that I believe was dark gray. It was torn to pieces and fluttering violently, as though hurricane winds were blowing. I don't remember sounds or smells. There's no blood on it, and I don't recall seeing any body parts, just the shirt. My brain didn't or couldn't register what I was seeing. I looked at this apparition for about 10 seconds, then drove off. A moment after that, I turned to my wife without saying a word. She was smiling at me and asked, "Did you see it?" Every word of this is true, and the event happened. There was no mistaking what my wife and I saw for anything other than what it was. So when I was 13, I was laying in bed, posting on Reddit trying to get a higher rank in karma. Karma in Reddit lingo is what they call getting followers or subscribers. As I'm posting about some funny meme, I hear a quiet knock. At first I didn't think much of it, as this is an old house I live in and tends to make noises from time to time. But then I heard it again. Knock. I noticed it this time as it was not louder but noticeably with more force. I started getting scared, so I pulled up my blanket and closed my eyes, hoping sleep would spare me the trauma of what was to come. As I'm laying there, I hear a knock, but now it's in my room, with me.